Players in the WNBA, when they do something deplorable, do something sickening, do something with malice, with cruel intent, they are going to play the victim. Oh, we're a league full of members of the LGBTQ community. We need to play the victim. Somebody out there lately was like, they're going to try to make Alyssa Thomas into a hero. I don't care. I never did care.
Predictability in a professional sports controversy is itself information worth analyzing. When the outcome of an accountability situation, specifically how the player at the center of it is going to respond publicly, can be predicted with enough accuracy that people are saying it out loud before the response even arrives, you are not watching a unique or surprising development. You are watching a pattern execute itself in real time. The victim framing following documented flagrant contact in professional basketball is not new. It is not specific to this incident or this player. It is a documented response pattern that emerges consistently when players face accountability for conduct that the footage makes difficult to defend on its merits. The shift from the conduct itself to the social media environment surrounding the conduct is the standard move in that pattern because it redirects the accountability conversation from what happened on the floor, which is documented and specific, to what happened online, which is unverifiable in general and much easier to shape into a sympathetic narrative. Setting your watch by it is the accurate characterization, not because it predicts anything about Thomas specifically as a person, but because the pattern itself is consistent enough across enough similar situations to function as a reliable predictor. What makes this specific instance of the pattern notable is the timing. 5 days after footage that produced a flagrant 2 classification circulated across every platform in the sports world and generated mainstream media coverage from voices who have no particular stake in the outcome. 5 days of the basketball world forming its conclusions based on the footage, and then an interview that opens with "I did not even know the play happened." The prediction was right, the pattern executed, the comment section called it before the interview aired. Here's exactly how it played out.
That's code word for "we want you to squash free speech." I don't know how else to say it. We're the victim here. You know what? Caitlin Clark should probably just retire. Because it's clear after hearing these comments, and we're not even nearly all through them, nothing registered here to change behavior. That's all anybody's asking for, is for these players to change their behavior, and she is telling you we're not going to do that.
The most revealing sentence in Thomas's entire interview is not the one about death threats or the one about the commissioner's silence. It is the one where she says there are a lot of other plays you could say the same about. That sentence, presented as a defense of the 1-game suspension being insufficient, actually functions as an acknowledgement that the specific category of conduct being discussed is not something Thomas views as outside the range of acceptable competitive basketball. She is not saying the contact with Clark was unacceptable and should not have happened. She is saying the suspension was appropriate given the standard applied, but that the standard should be applied more broadly. Read that carefully. The argument is not that she should not have been suspended. The argument is that other players who do similar things also should be. That is not an accountability statement. That is a whataboutism deployed in the specific form that avoids accountability by universalizing it. If everyone is doing it, no one is specifically responsible for it. And if no one is specifically responsible for it, the suspension becomes an arbitrary application of a standard rather than a reasonable response to documented conduct. Nothing registered to change behavior. That is the analytical conclusion that the totality of Thomas's interview supports. Not because she said anything explicitly dismissive of the concern for player safety, because the framing she chose, ignorance of the incident, universalization of the conduct, victimhood around the response, produces a complete circuit of deflection that never arrives at the place where the conduct is acknowledged as wrong, and the commitment to different conduct going forward is stated clearly. That is what the deterrence failure looks like from inside the player's own media response.
Yeah, the commissioner should have come out and taken a stand against you. You got a very weak, limp dick suspension of 1 game. I mean, something that would have been more fair, How about 10 games and $50,000? Because only until the WNBA hands down real reprimands, real punishment, are any of these players going to get it, because they don't care if they get a 1-game suspension. They don't.
The specific numbers matter here, and they deserve to be stated and examined rather than treated as rhetorical flourishes. 10 games, $50,000. Those are not arbitrary figures chosen for dramatic effect. They are the minimum threshold argument for what a suspension in this specific situation would need to be to function as an actual deterrent rather than a competitive inconvenience that a player and organization can absorb without any meaningful behavioral change. 1 game sits out against Toronto. Thomas misses 1 game. She comes back healthy and returns to competition. The competitive impact of the suspension on the Mercury is measurable and contained. The message the 1 game sends to every other player in the league about the institutional cost of this category of contact is equally measurable and equally contained. The commissioner should have come out and taken a stand against the conduct, not been cited by the player who was suspended for the conduct as an example of league silence. That inversion, where Thomas calls out Kathy Engelberg for not defending her, while the footage documents Thomas as the player who caused the incident requiring Engelberg's response, is the specific accountability gap that this clip is naming. Real reprimands produce real behavioral change. That is not a complicated proposition. It is the basic logic of deterrence that every professional sports governance structure operates on when it is functioning correctly. Professional athletes make rational calculations. They assess the risk and reward of competitive decisions against the consequences available to them in the institutional environment they operate within. A 1-game suspension is a consequence that has been assessed by the player who received it and by every player watching her receive it. The assessment is that it is manageable. 10 games and $50,000 produces a different assessment.
Kathy Engelberg, look, 10 games minimum, $50,000, but there is an absolute case that for the sake of the league, they could have kicked her out for good. For the business side of this league and the betterment of the league, they could have used her as an example and booted her ass out of the league. You think if I'm worried about my bottom line after not having a turn to profit in 30 years, I'm going to worry about her? Nah. Now we're good. You could be gone out of this league today. Not a single solitary person outside of what? 37 fans in Phoenix are going to miss you.
The business argument for real consequences is the one that strips away everything else and arrives at the commercial logic that professional sports leagues ultimately answer to when every other consideration has been exhausted. The WNBA has not turned a profit in 30 years. That is not a criticism. It is the financial context within which every institutional decision the league makes exists. A league that has been operating at a loss for 3 decades and that is currently navigating the most significant commercial growth period in its history does not make decisions about player discipline in a vacuum disconnected from the commercial environment that growth is happening in. Thomas brings 37 fans in Phoenix. The exact number is rhetorical rather than literal, but the commercial logic it represents is not. Thomas's market value to the WNBA as a commercial asset is fundamentally different from Clark's market value to the WNBA as a commercial asset. That is not a statement about Thomas's basketball ability or her worth as a person. It is a commercial reality that the league's own viewership and attendance data confirms every time Clark plays and every time she does not. The case for a longer suspension, even up to and including a league exit for the most egregious documented repeat offender, rests on the same commercial logic. You protect the asset that generates 3 million viewers because that is what a commercially rational organization does when it understands what its most valuable asset actually is. The 37 fans versus 3 million viewers framing is direct enough to feel provocative, but it is grounded in the real commercial differential between these two players' market value to the league. 30 years years without profit. 3 million viewers when Clark plays. The business case writes itself. You could set your watch by the victim card. That was the prediction. That was the outcome. Thomas sat down 5 days after the footage became the most talked about moment in women's sports and produced an interview that moved through every stage of the deflection pattern. I did not know it happened. It was an accident. There are death threats. The commissioner is silent. Other players do similar things. The narrative being painted is unfair. Not one sentence in any of that amounts to, what I did was wrong and I am committed to not doing it again. That is the sentence that the footage and the flagrant 2 classification and the 1 game suspension were supposed to produce. That is the sentence that real deterrence produces from players who process the consequence and adjust accordingly. That sentence did not arrive. Nothing registered to change behavior. The interview confirmed it. The commercial argument is the one that should reach the people with the authority to produce real consequences. 30 years without profit. 3 million viewers when Clark plays. The asset that generates 3 million viewers absorbed a fist to the throat from a player whose market value to the league is categorically different. The institutional response was 1 game. 1 game did not produce the sentence that would confirm deterrence worked. The interview produced the victim narrative that confirmed it did not. 10 games and $50,000 was the stated minimum. The logic of that minimum is in the commercial data that the WNBA's own records contain and that every broadcast partner and every sponsor has access to when they evaluate what they are paying for. The victim card was played. The comment section called it before the interview started. The business case for why the card should not work is in the 3 million viewers that Clark brings to the table every time she plays. Drop your thoughts below.